What is up, everybody? This is Byron Kingsley, and welcome to this very special video. Today is July 2nd, 2022, exactly 40 years after the release of my favorite anime movie of all time, The Secret of NIMH. As much as I worship the shit out of this movie, I figured I'd do a fan audio commentary, but first, a quick tidbit. This was my third copy of the film on DVD. The first was scratched up and the second was lost, and I have no idea what the fuck it is. Back in 2010, I got the third copy of the movie, given that I love the shit out of it. It's been around here for 12 years. Now then, like some people, I will not show the movie due to copyright, but I will be quoting lines to let you know where I'm at. So if you're watching it ad-free on YouTube Movies, if you have bad internet connection, you could just skip a few seconds or so you can catch up. While we watch the movie, I'm going to tell you the making of this film as well as the biographies of the cast and crew for your enjoyment. Now, before we begin, I want you to know that my copy of the film was the MGM DVD 1998 reprint instead of the Family Fun Edition re-released in 2007 for the film's 25th anniversary. In my copy, it showed the 1990s United Artists logo instead of the original one after the MGM logo in the Family Fun Edition. So, in order to start, if you had a recent copy or the 1998 reprint like I had, when the words "A Don Bluth Production" as well as the blue background fade out, that's when you pause the movie. When I say 3, 2, 1, play, that's when you hit play. I'm going to give you enough time to get ready, like waiting for the movie to load. Okay, all set? Alright, here we go. Beginning commentary in 3, 2, 1, play. Okay, after the first line of credits, in this scene, we got our first appearance of the mysterious wizard Nicodemus, voiced by Derek Jacobi, although we can see his hands as he writes in his book, as well as his face reflecting on a stone, which we'll see play soon. Gotta love the lighting effects as he writes. And remember, this is from 1982, and seeing this animation, it still holds up to this very day. It was also the same year The Plague Dogs was released, and it also had great animation, which was more realistic. And here it is, the most important object in the movie, as well as Nicodemus's face. And you will not return. We'll be seeing him as well as the amulet again. What a great prologue to start the movie. Right now, we see this really, really awesome opening title, all done with outstanding effects, which I will be discussing later on. Upon release, The Secret of NIMH grossed at $14.7 million against half of the budget. The film's distributor barely did any promotion for the film, leading Aurora to finance the advertising campaign themselves. The financiers had expected the film to open in wide release in 1,000 venues, but MGM opted for a limited opening weekend in 100 theaters, with its widest release in only 700. Although in competition with E.T. the Extraterrestrial, it performed better in those theaters alone in its opening week than Poltergeist, Rocky III, and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. However, as a result of its release and competition with other summer fare, NIMH became only a moderate success, but it was more successful on home video, cable, and foreign releases, ultimately turning a profit. So right now, inside this old thrashing machine is where we're introduced to our protagonist, Mrs. Jonathan Brisby, voiced by the late Elizabeth Hartman in her final role, as well as Mr. Ages, voiced by Arthur Mallet. Elizabeth Hartman was born on December 23rd, 1943 in Youngstown, Ohio. She was an American actress of the stage and screen and debuted in the popular 1965 film A Patch of Blue, playing a blind girl opposite Sidney Poitier, a role for which she was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress and a Golden Globe Award. She appeared in Francis Ford Coppola's You're a Big Boy Now in 1966, for which she was nominated for a second Golden Globe Award. Hartman also starred opposite Clint Eastwood and Geraldine Page in Don Siegel's The Beguiled, and the 1973 film Walking Tall, starring Joe Don Baker. On stage, Hartman is remembered for her interpretations of Laura Wingfield in The Glass Menagerie, for which she won Ohio's Actress of the Year Award, and Emily Webb in the 1969 Broadway production of Our Town. Hartman retired from acting in 1982 after starring in this movie. Throughout much of her life, Hartman suffered from depression. In 1978, she was treated at the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut. In 1984, she divorced her husband, screenwriter Gil Dennis, after a 5-year separation. In the last few years of her life, she gave up acting altogether and worked at a museum in Pittsburgh while receiving treatment for her condition at an outpatient clinic. In 1981, she returned to theater, portraying Myrtle Brown in a regional stage production of Mornings at 7. On June 10, 1987, Hartman died after jumping from the window of her 5th-floor apartment. Earlier that morning, she had reportedly called her psychiatrist saying that she felt despondent. Hartman was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in her hometown. Mrs. Brisby's first name was unknown until after the death of her voice actress Elizabeth Hartman. From that point on, it was, and currently is, declared her first name by many fans in loving memory of Hartman. This is one of the reasons Hartman's memory lives on after 40 years. As you can see, Mrs. Brisby was taking Mr. H's lab so he can give her the medicine for her son diagnosed with pneumonia, and warns her that Timothy must stay inside for at least 3 weeks or he will die. We'll be discussing about Arthur Mallet later on. So now, in this next scene, we are introduced to our comic relief of the movie, Jeremy the Crow, voiced by Don Bluth veteran Dom DeLuise. Dom DeLuise was born in Brooklyn in 1933. He was an American actor, comedian, director, producer, chef, and author. Known primarily for his comedic performances, he rose to fame in the 1970s as a frequent guest on television variety shows. He is often identified for his work in the films of Mel Brooks, such as Blazing Saddles, Spaceballs, Robin Hood Men in Tights, and History of the World Part 1, as well as a series of collaborations and appearances with Burt Reynolds, such as the Cannonball Run series, Smokey and the Bandit 2, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and another Don Bluth film, All Dogs Go to Heaven, released 7 years after NIMH. Beginning in the 1980s, his popularity expanded to younger audiences from voicing characters in several major animated productions, particularly those of Don Bluth. He was also the voice of Stanley from that god-awful Troll in Central Park, which is considered Bluth's worst film. He starred as a Hollywood agent in 1979's The Muppet Movie, in a cameo after he guest starred in an episode of The Muppet Show in 1977. Aside from Don Bluth films, he stars in Disney's Oliver and Company, Happily Ever After, and most infamously, Christopher Columbus in the Hemdale English dub of The Magic Voyage, which stars Corey Feldman. DeLuise died of kidney failure on May 4th, 2009 at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, California, at the age of 75. He had been battling cancer for more than a year prior to his health and was also suffering from high blood pressure and diabetes. Burt Reynolds paid tribute to DeLuise in the Los Angeles Times, saying, "As you get older and start to lose people you love, you think about it more. And I was dreading this moment. Dom always made you feel better when he was around, and there will never be another like him." Sadly, this humorous moment will so not end well for the both of them, and rightfully so. Uh-oh, here comes Dragon, who is designed to feel as monstrous and menacing as possible. Despite the film getting a G rating by the MPAA, the film was known for being dark for a children's movie. The cat reminds me of those Cossack cats in Don Bluth's next film, An American Tail, released 4 years after NIMH. Similar to movies like The Dark Crystal, Watership Down, Return to Oz, and The Last Unicorn, the film has a very serious tone that doesn't talk down to children because it has a ton of pretty suspenseful scenes, like this chase scene, as well as the next scene with a tractor, which we'll see later. It also has great faith and trust in its child audience's intelligences, which is well demonstrated throughout the entirety of the film, due to its dark tone and countless amount of dark suspenseful and emotional moments. "The string! Quick! Grab the string!" So let's briefly talk about the production. The film rights to the book Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH had reportedly been offered to Walt Disney Productions in 1972, but they were turned down. Rightfully so, because the final product is so dark even Disney wouldn't do it. However, in hindsight, Disney would go on releasing a box office flop called The Black Cauldron in 1985, the first animated Disney film to receive a PG rating. Now we're at the old mill where Mrs. Frisby sits crying because she lost the medicine for Timmy during the chase with the cat. However, hope is restored because Jeremy happened to have the medicine with him, which we'll see in a minute. What's interesting is that this is where the boat scene took place, in the same old mill, but it was shown from underneath. We'll see that in the beginning of the third act. And wet with water. Now here comes that part. And it's from under his wing. Took me a few screens to notice it. Now, okay, let's talk about the production and how it came to be. In 1979, Don Bluth, fellow animators Gary Goldman and John Pomeroy, and 8 other animation staff left the feature animation department at Disney to set up their own independent studio, Don Bluth Productions. The studio worked at first out of Bluth's house and garage, but moved to a 2-story facility in Studio City, California, 7 months later. While they were still working at Disney, they produced a 27-minute short film, Banjo the Woodpile Cat, as a side project to gain other production skills that the company and their animation program were not addressing. Bluth asked Ron W. Miller, the president and CEO of Disney at the time, to view Banjo, but Miller declined. As Goldman recalled, that pulled the enthusiasm rug out from under us. We had hoped that the studio might like what we were doing and agree to buy the film and allow us to finish the short film in the studio, which will allow us to recoup what we had spent in terms of money and the many hours that we and the other members of the team had invested in the film. Before they started making Banjo, artist and storywriter Ken Anderson had been getting into Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, which he called a wonderful story. He gave the book to Bluth for him to read and make a film out of after Bluth finished the animation direction of Pete's Dragon. Bluth later showed NIMH to Disney animation director Wolfgang Reitherman, who turned down Bluth's offers to make a movie based on the book. He said, "We've already got a mouse, and we've done a mouse movie." However, Bluth also presented the novel to the other staff that would work for Don Bluth Productions later on, and they all loved it. 2 months later, former Disney executive James L. Stewart, who now had started Aurora Productions, called Goldman and told him about Anderson's ideas of making a film based on NIMH. At Bluth, Goldman, and Pomeroy's requests, Aurora Productions acquired the film rights and offered Don Bluth Productions a budget of $5.7 million and 30 months to complete the film, tighter in both budget and schedule than most animated features of the time. Now, in this next scene, as you can see, this is where we first see the Brisby children, with the exception of Timmy, which we'll see in a moment. And here's the first appearance of Auntie Shrew, voiced by Hermione Bedelly in her last role. Hermione Bedelly was born on November 13th, 1986. She was an English actress of theater, film, and television. She typically played brash, vulgar characters, often referred to as brassy or blowsy. She found her milieu in revue, in which she played from the 1930s to the 1950s, co-starring several times with the English actress Hermione Gingold. Bedelly was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her performance in Room at the Top in 1959, and a Tony Award for Best Performance by a Leading Actress in a Play for The Milk Train Doesn't Stop There Anymore in 1963. She played Mrs. Cratchit in the 1951 film Scrooge, and Ellen the Maid in the 1964 Disney film Mary Poppins. She voiced Madame in Disney's The Aristocats. In 1975, she won a Golden Globe Award for Best Supporting Actress in a television series for her portrayal of Nell Nagatuk on the TV series Maude. Bedelly was known for her devotion to animals. She dedicated her autobiography, The Unsinkable Hermione Bedelly, to her pet dog. She continued to work in film and television until shortly before the end of her life. She died following a series of strokes on August 19th, 1986, at the age of 79 in Los Angeles. Not for a King's Ransom. Now, as for the children, Martin is voiced by Will Wheaton, Teresa was voiced by Shannon Doherty, and Cynthia was voiced by Jodie Hicks. Sadly, I can't find information about Jodie Hicks except that she starred in 2 TV movies, A Long Way Home in 1981, directed by Richard Markowitz, and Right of Way in 1983, starring Betty Davis and James Stewart, directed by George Schaefer. But I will discuss the child actors later on. And right now, we're about to hear the movie's main theme, as Mrs. Brisby gives the medicine to Timmy in bed, which was called Flying Dreams. Even though this wasn't a musical, one of the few Don Bluth films that isn't a musical. This song has 2 versions. One which you're hearing was sung by vocal contractor Sally Stevens, which sounds like a lullaby, and rightfully so. And the other, at the end of the movie, was sung by famous songwriter Paul Williams, known for writing and co-writing popular songs performed by a number of acts in the 1970s, including Three Dog Nights, An Old-Fashioned Love Song, and Out in the Country, Helen Reddy's You and Me Against the World, Tiny Tim's Fill Your Heart, and The Carpenters, We've Only Just Begun, and Rainy Days and Mondays. He's also known for writing the score and lyrics for the cult classic Bugsy Malone in 1976, and his musical contributions to other films, including the Oscar-nominated song Rainbow Connection from the Muppet Movie, and writing the lyrics to the #1 chart-topping song Evergreen, the love theme from the Barbra Streisand remake of A Star is Born, for which he won a Grammy for Song of the Year and an Academy Award for Best Original Song. Now, later on, given that this was based on the book by Robert C. O'Brien in 1971, I'll be comparing this to the film as we go along. Such a very wonderful shot with the Brisby family framed in the bedroom window as we zoom out until we see the Fitzgibbons farmhouse in the background. One of the most iconic shots in the entire movie. Off to bed with you now. Now here is where we see our first glimpse of the rats of NIMH as they steal the extension cord from the Fitzgibbons' attic. That's Tom Hatton and Lucille Bliss voicing the Fitzgibbons. It would be nice if this brief scene with the farmhouse was the opening scene of the movie before Nicodemus writes his book, as discussed in how a proper adaptation should be like. You'll find the video in the description below, as well as a Synthestra cover of the movie's theme called NIMH 82. As you can see, inside the rose bush, some weird lights began flickering, but we shall see what's inside later on. Now here comes another intense scene, which was perfectly accompanied with the music of Jerry Goldsmith, which I'll talk about in a moment. According to Chapter 5 in the original book, the tractor wasn't much of a threat because the linchpin is sheared off before it can start plowing, which means the Fitzgibbons will have to order a new one. The last time they had to order a new one, it took 5 days to arrive, which is enough time to move the house out of danger with help from the rats. Now, as you can see on the top of the stone, we see Auntie Shrew approaching Mrs. Brisby, urging her and the children to leave because it's moving day. But Mrs. Brisby was concerned about Timmy because he can't get out of bed for 3 weeks or he'll die from pneumonia. Well, too late, because the tractor's coming! Anyway, some of the animation, like this tractor, which you'll see in a moment, was rotoscoped. There it is, although it seemed uncanny apart from the typical Disney-like animation we've seen. This does remind me of a similar scene from Watership Down, where the animals leave their home as it will later become urbanized. Now let's talk about composer Jerry Goldsmith. He was born in 1929 and was best known for writing scores for 5 films in the Star Trek franchise and 3 in the Rambo franchise, as well as for Logan's Run, directed by Michael Anderson, the original Planet of the Apes and Patton, both directed by Franklin Schaffner, Tora Tora Tora, directed by Richard Fleischer, Chinatown, directed by Roman Polanski, Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, Poltergeist, directed by Tobe Hooper, Gremlins, directed by Joe Dante, Hoosiers, directed by David Anspaugh, Total Recall, directed by Paul Verhoeven, Air Force One, directed by Wolfgang Peterson, LA Confidential, directed by Curtis Hanson, Disney's Mulan, and the 1999 remake of The Mummy. With the release of The Lost World Jurassic Park, his 1997 opening fanfare for Universal Pictures debuted. His work on the fanfare would later be rearranged by Brian Tyler for the studio's 100th anniversary. He also composed the 1976 fanfare for Paramount Pictures, which was used mainly for their home video label. He also composed the music for the Disney attraction Soarin', which is still operating in Disney's California Adventure. His final work as composer was the music for Looney Tunes Back in Action in 2003, before his death in 2004 at the age of 75. The Secret of NIMH was Goldsmith's first composition for an animated feature, which he admitted was such a departure from his normal work that in the end he approached the project like a live-action score, employing the same kind of extended themes and structural development. What made the scoring process hard for Goldsmith was that he had to score scenes that were unfinished. I was on the phone constantly with them. My dupe was in black and white, and they bring their color copy over so I could see it. They were constantly adding footage, and it was constantly what's going on here and what's happening here. Now, as you can see, Mrs. Brisby tried to stop the tractor from destroying her house and killing her son, but didn't have the courage to do so, only to have Auntie Shrew stop it herself. Right now, we go back to Nicodemus' chamber, where we see Mrs. Brisby and Auntie Shrew in some magical viewing device as Nicodemus watches. For now, Mrs. Brisby, despite being sweet and motherly, is depicted as shy and timid in the beginning and is scared easily. But in the second act, with advice from the Great Owl, she became willing to do anything to save his son, even if it meant visiting the Rats of NIMH. This became even more evolved when she received the stone from Nicodemus. Again, we have another great shot from the movie with Nicodemus. Now we see Jeremy flying through the evening air with Mrs. Brisby on his back. Earlier, after the chasing with a cat, Mrs. Brisby refused to accept Jeremy's offer to fly home because she's afraid of heights. And we can see why. Owls eat mice. Only after dark. Gotta love some dark humor right there. Now, Jeremy's flight to the Great Owl was one of the early completed scenes that were shown to potential investors to raise funds for this movie, as well as the earlier one with Nicodemus and the viewing device. Now, here we are at the Owl's Old Tree, which is something out of Disney's Sleeping Beauty. In a few moments, we'll be hearing the voice of John Carradine as the Great Owl from outside the tree. So much eerie atmosphere with the cobwebs and the sound of the wind from inside. Boy, were you wrong. Here it is, the voice of John Carradine as the Great Owl, although we don't see him yet. Just for the sake of the new adaptation, I want Tony Todd to voice him. Just imagine him voicing the Great Owl, and he was best known for his deep, chilling voice. Anyway, before we discuss about John Carradine, here's another shocking moment with her stumbling over a pile of mouse bones like something out of a horror movie. Granted that this was given a G rating by the MPAA. Uh-oh. Just when you thought things aren't going to get any worse, there's this giant spider ready to attack her. But thankfully, this is where we see the great owl as he crushes the spider with his talons. And here he is, the great owl himself, so intimidating by his height as it towers over poor Brisby, as well as his glowing eyes, all done by special effects, which I'll be talking about later during the rosebush scene. That's the same moth we saw earlier. Anyway, let's talk about John Carradine. He was born in 1906 and was a member of Cecil B. DeMille's stock company, and later John Ford's company, best known for his roles in horror films, westerns, and Shakespearean theater. In the latter decades of his career, he starred mostly in low-budget B-movies, but continued to also appear in a higher-profile fare. In total, he holds 351 film and television credits, making him one of the most prolific English-speaking actors of all time. Carradine was married 4 times, had 5 children, and was the patriarch of the Carradine family, including 4 sons and 4 grandchildren who are or were also actors. One of which was David Carradine, who is known for playing martial arts roles, including the title character of both the Kill Bill movies, directed by Quentin Tarantino. As for roles, I saw him in The Grapes of Wrath, released in 1940. He was Aaron in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, released in 1956. The voice of Tyrone T. Tattersall in Shin Bone Alley, released in 1970. And The Bees, released in 1978. The same year Irwin Allen's The Swarm was released. Semi-retired, Carradine suffered from painful and crippling rheumatoid arthritis before he died from heart and kidney failure at Milan, Italy in 1988 at the age of 82. Now, notice the owl limping towards the entrance after he tells her to visit a colony of rats that live beneath a rosebush on the farm and ask for the services of Nicodemus, their wise and mystical leader. As he flies off into the night, this is where the first act of the movie ends for me, and the second act to begin. The Lee of the Stone. So right now, here we are at the second act of this movie, where Mrs. Brisby is going to the rose bush to see the rats. Anyway, let's talk about the writing of this film. The film's working title for the United States was Mrs. Brisby and the Rats of NIMH, before the title for the final product was changed. One of the earliest drafts of the film was written by Stephen Barnes, who received a creative consultant credit in the final project and was closer to the original novel. The story would have focused more on the rats and their time at NIMH as it did in the book, which was reduced to a short flashback in later revisions to bring Mrs. Brisby and her plight into the forefront. It also included, for the book, a female rat named Isabella, described as a young, cute, somewhat motor-mouthed rat with a crush on Justin, who was ultimately left out, and much of her dialogue was given to Nicodemus. A revised synopsis dated July 2nd, 1980, by an unattributed author would take the movie closer to its completed form, which ended with the mysterious disappearance of the rats, leading the characters and audience to wonder if they ever really existed or were just an elaborate illusion. During the film's production, Aurora contacted Whammo, the manufacturers of Frisbee flying discs, with concerns about possible trademark infringements if the Mrs. Frisbee name in O'Brien's original book was used in the movie. Whammo rejected Aurora's request for waiver to use the same sounding name to their Frisbee in the movie. Aurora informed Bluth and Company that Mrs. Frisbee's name would have to be altered. By then, the voice work had already been recorded for the film, so the name change to Mrs. Brisbee necessitated a combination of re-recording some lines, and because John Carradine was unavailable for further recordings, careful sound editing had to be performed, taking the B sound of another word from Carradine's recorded lines and replace the F sound with the B sound, altering the name from Frisbee to Brisbee. I've never seen a cat sleep so much. As we go inside the rose bush, let's finally talk about the animation, which makes this movie such an underrated classic. The production of the movie lasted from January 1980 to early June 1982, just a month before the release. The studio set out with the explicit goal in mind of returning feature animation to its golden era, concentrating on strong characters and story, and experimented with unusual and often more labor-intensive animation techniques. Bluth believed older techniques were being abandoned in favor of lower production costs, and the only way that animation could survive was to continue traditional production methods. Among the techniques experimented with were rotoscoping, multiple passes on the camera to achieve transparent shadows, backlit animation where animated mats are shot with light shining through color gels to produce glowing areas for artificial light and fire effects, and multiple color palettes for characters to fit in different lighting situations, from daylight to night to warm environments to underwater. Mrs. Brisbee had 46 different lighting situations, therefore there were 46 color palettes or lists of color for her. 2 modern computerized versions of the multiplane camera were also manufactured for this production. And right now, we're gonna see Mrs. Brisbee meet a huge aggressive guard gnat named Brutus. And there's him with his electric battle axe. Like in the book, Brutus guards the entrance to the rosebush, though not antagonistic per se. Brutus simply gives Mrs. Brisbee a hard time before letting her into the rosebush. In the movie, however, he chased her out like some kind of axe-crazy maniac, no pun intended. Also, in the book, he had dialogue and is one of the 10 rats who volunteered to stay behind during the extermination from NIMH. We may never see him again until the climax of the movie. Speaking of him, let's talk about Arthur Mallet. He was born in 1927 and was known for starring as Mr. Jaws Jr. in Mary Poppins, a village elder in Young Frankenstein, King Bedelly in The Black Cauldron, and Toodles and Hook. In another Don Bluth film, Anastasia, he voiced the traveling man Major Domo. He died on May 18, 2013 at the age of 85 in Santa Monica. Now let's discuss more about animation. To achieve the film's detailed full animation while keeping to the tight budget, the studio strove to keep any waste of time and resources to a minimum. The crew often worked long hours with no immediate financial reward. Producer Gary Goldman recalled working 110-hour weeks during the final 6 months of production. Around 100 in-house staff worked on the film, with a labor-intensive cell painting farmed out to 45 people working from home. Many minor roles, including incidental and crowd voice work, were filled in by Bluth, Goldman, and Pomeroy, and the executive producers at Aurora mortgaged their homes collectively for $700,000 to complete the film, with the understanding that their investment would be the first to be repaid. Now right here, Brutus's name was mentioned by Mr. Ages when Mrs. Brisby asked about the larger at the entrance. So now we're with Nicodemus again, as he watches Mrs. Brisby and Mr. Ages from the sphere. And in the same brief scene, we see our first glimpse of the main antagonist, Jenner, which I'll explain both the voice actor, Paul Shenar, and the character from the book later on. He is consumed by a lust for power. And there's the amulet again in Nicodemus's hands, just like we saw earlier. Now, as Mr. Ages leads Mrs. Brisby deeper, this is where she noticed that the inside of the rose bush had electricity, which was stolen from the Fitzgibbons farmhouse. And there's another beautiful shot from the movie with the Christmas lights and the old-fashioned toys. Now, notice the toy soldiers lined up on the left side of the screen. One of them is the next supporting character, Justin, voiced by Peter Strauss. Now, let's talk about Peter Strauss. He was born in 1947. Aside from starring in theatrical films such as Soldier Blue in 1970 and Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone in 1983, his filmography is mostly made-for-TV movies and miniseries. He won an Emmy Award for his role on the 1979 made-for-TV movie The Jericho Mile, and he starred in a television remake of the classic 1946 film Angel on My Shoulder in 1980. In 1985, he played Abel Rosnowski in the miniseries Cain and Abel. His other noted television miniseries credits include starring roles in Rich Man, Poor Man, its sequel Rich Man, Poor Man Book 2, and Masada. Strauss played Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. in the 1977 TV movie Young Joe, The Forgotten Kennedy. In 1973, he portrayed Stephen Linder, Mary Richards' suave younger boyfriend, in the Mary Tyler Moore Show 4th season episode, Angels in the Snow. Back in the early days of the NIMH fandom, there was a good amount of battle between Justin X. Brisby and Jonathan X. Brisby. This was fueled by a still image of Justin and Mrs. Brisby kissing, rumored to be a shot of a scene cut from the movie. Gotta love the architecture from the inside of the rosebush. The voice you've heard was Paul Shenar as Jenner, which you'll see in a moment. The voices of the council members were done by Charles Champlin, Dick Kleiner, and Norbert Auerbach. And here's Jenner, the main villain of the movie, probably the first Don Bluth villain. In the original novel, Jenner's role is less antagonistic. He forms a group of 6 rats that objects against Nicodemus, but decides to leave the rosebush to form his own settlement. Later on, about 6 or 7 rats are found at a hardware store electrocuted to death next to a plugged-in motor that they were trying to move. The other characters assume that this was Jenner and his group. That's all there is Sullivan, but first, let's talk about Paul Shenar. He was born in 1936 in Milwaukee. Following his military career, Shenar gained attention playing Orson Welles in 1975's The Night That Panicked America and Florence Siegfried Jr. in 1978's Siegfried, the Man and His Woman. In 1983, Shenar also portrayed Alejandro Sosa in Brian De Palma's Scarface, and later portrayed Paula Roca in Raw Deal in 1986. His performance in The Secret of NIMH impressed Blue so much that he wanted Shenar to also portray Borf in Space Ace, but was unable to do so due to budget issues, and the role ultimately went to Bluth himself. Shenar was gay and was romantically involved with the British actor Jeremy Brett, who's known for starring in 1964's My Fair Lady during the 1970s. They were in a relationship that reportedly lasted from 1971 to 1978. After the couple separated, they remained close friends until Shenar's death from AIDS in 1989. So, we're back in the Brisby home with Jeremy. Unfortunately, things don't go a lot well for him, all tied up from head to foot. In the original book, this character is only ever called the Shrew. She's also not quite the acerbic fuss budget that she is in the movie, but she still has very strong opinions and considers herself responsible for the welfare and the news of the field. Described in the book as having a wit as sharp as her teeth, she uses both to good effect. Near the end of the story, as the rats of NIMH are preparing to move the Frisbee family home, the Shrew actually holds them at bay and bites one of the rats on the leg. It takes Mrs. Frisbee's timely intervention to convince her that the rats are not there to steal anything from her home or cause any other kind of trouble. And here we see one of the children, Teresa, approaching Auntie Shrew. She'll later be joined by Martin and Cynthia. Now here's an unexpected reference to Douglas MacArthur. And here's the rest of the children. Anyway, let's talk about Shannon Doherty, the voice of Teresa. She was born in Memphis in 1971. She is known for her roles as Jenny Wilder in the TV series Little House on the Prairie, Maggie Moline in Girls Just Want to Have Fun in 1985, starring Sarah Jessica Parker, Chris Witherspoon in the NBC show Our House, Heather Duke in the cult black comedy Heathers, Brenda Walsh in Beverly Hills 90210, Prue Halliwell in WB's Charmed, and recently Dobbs in Fortress in 2021. Very, very poor choice of words. Anyway, on to Will Wheaton. He was born in 1972 and is an American actor, blogger, and New York Times bestselling writer. He portrayed Wesley Crusher in Star Trek The Next Generation, Goldie LaChance in the film Stand By Me in 1986, Joey Trotta in Toy Soldiers, and Benedict Honecker in Disney's Flubber. Wheaton has also appeared in recurring voice acting roles as Aqualad in Teen Titans, Cosmic Boy on the Legion of Superheroes, and Mike Morningstar, aka Darkstar, in the Ben 10 franchise. He appeared regularly as a fictionalized version of himself on the sitcom The Big Bang Theory, and in the roles of Fox on The Guild, Colin Mason on Leverage, and Dr. Isaac Parrish on Eureka. Wheaton was the host and co-creator of the YouTube board game show Tabletop. He has narrated numerous audiobooks, including Ernest Cline's Ready Player One and Ready Player Two. So, now we're 40 minutes into the movie, and back in the Rosebush, we're about to see Nicodemus fully for the first time. Gotta love this shot when the door opens and a flutter of light and force streams out of it, and Mrs. Brisby gets out of the way. So now we're in Nicodemus's chamber. Come closer, my child. On the right side of the screen, we fully see Nicodemus as he's sitting on an ornate throne in the center of the room. Now let's talk about Derek Jacobi, the voice of Nicodemus. He was born in 1938 in England. Although he's a film actor, he's best known for acting in various stage productions of William Shakespeare. He is also known for his performances in Anton Chekhov's Uncle Vanya and Edmond Rostan's Cyrano de Bergerac. He was given a knighthood for his services to theater by Queen Elizabeth II in 1994 and is a member of the Danish Order of the Dannebrog. Though principally a stage actor, Jacobi appeared in a number of films, including Othello in 1965, The Day of the Jackal in 1973, Henry V in 1989, Dead Again in 1991, Hamlet in 1996, Gladiator in 2000, Gosford Park in 2001, Nanny McPhee in 2005, The Riddle in 2007, The King's Speech in 2010, My Week with Marilyn and Anonymous, both released in 2011, the 2015 remake of Disney's Cinderella, and Murder on the Orient Express in 2017. Jacobi has twice been awarded a Laurence Olivier Award, first for his performance in Cyrano de Bergerac in 1983, and the second for his performance in Twelfth Night in 2009. He also received a Tony Award for his performance in Much Ado About Nothing in 1984. Jacobi has also received 2 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Miniseries or Movie for The 10th Man, and Outstanding Guest Actor in a Comedy Series for Frasier. Jacobi also earned 2 Screen Actors Guild Awards along with the ensemble cast of Gosford Park and The King's Speech. So now we see the full origin of the Rats of NIMH as told by Nicodemus. In the beginning, we are ordinary street rats. Now let's talk about the actual story of NIMH. The original book is based on the works of John B. Calhoun, who in the early 1960s worked at the National Institute of Mental Health. Between 1968 and 1970, Calhoun conducted a behavioral study of captive mice within a 9-square-foot enclosure at a rural facility in Poolesville, Maryland. Within the enclosure, known as Universe 25, several pairs of mice bred a population which ultimately swelled to 2,200. Eventually, they established social orders that created inside and outside factions, and soon mating ceased altogether. The study confirmed his grim hypothesis based on earlier studies of the Norway rat in small settings. In his theory, he suggested that overpopulation spawns a breakdown in social functions that, in turn, inevitably leads to extinction. Though widely controversial when first made public, Calhoun's theory has raised concern over the years that the social breakdown of Universe 25 could ultimately serve as a metaphor for the trajectory of the human race. Consequently, the Rodent Utopia project has been a subject of interest among architects, city planning councils, and government agencies around the world. We had become intelligent. As mentioned earlier, this flashback has been shortened, but in the original book, more important events happen in NIMH, like this intelligence test with an electrified maze. After they escape from NIMH, they head to a mansion called the Boniface Estate, where there's a library. Such untold backstory is the reason why a future adaptation of Rats of NIMH has to be a miniseries. Now, in the ventilation shaft, while the rest of the rats and mice die, we see two mice escaping. One of them was Brisby's husband, Jonathan, who subsequently died. We now go back to Nicodemus's chamber, as Nicodemus gives the amulet to Mrs. Brisby. Let's talk about the inclusion of mythical elements such as the stone. During the writing, Bluth himself would later make several changes to the story, most notably with the addition of said elements not present in the original novel. He explained that regarding magic, we really believe that animation calls for some magic to give it a special fantastic quality. This was most apparent in the stone given to Mrs. Brisby, which was meant to be a visual representation of her character's internal power, something harder to show on film. The object was also meant to introduce a spiritual aspect to the plot, with the director remarking, "The stone or amulet is just a method of letting the audience know that Mrs. Brisby has found courage of the heart. Magic? Maybe. Spiritual? Yes." In the same vein, Nicodemus was made into a wizard to create more mystery about himself and the rat's colony. Now, as Nicodemus and Mrs. Brisby leave his chamber, Jenner watches from around a corner with Sullivan. This is where the second act ends. Now, in the same book Nicodemus wrote about Jonathan, he also wrote about Jenner. It read, "Jenner has become cold-hearted. He uses his knowledge to fight against the plan of moving to Thorn Valley. I fear other rats may soon be swayed to his opinions. It is wrong to go on stealing. They've taken the animal out of you." Anyway, let's talk about Aldo Ray. He was born Aldo da Rey in 1926. He began his career as a contract player for Columbia Pictures before achieving stardom through his roles in 1952's The Merry Kind and Pat and Mike, which earned him a Golden Globe nomination, 1953's Let's Do It Again, and 1955's Battle Cry. His athletic build and gruff, raspy voice saw him frequently typecast in tough guy roles throughout his career, which lasted well into the late 1980s, though the latter part of his career was marked by appearances in low-budget B-movies and exploitation films. He still starred occasionally in higher-profile features, including this movie and 1987's The Sicilian, the film adaptation of the book by Mario Puzo. Since his passing in 1981, Ray's body of work and screen persona have undergone a reappraisal, and have been cited by contemporary filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino as an inspiration for their own characters, including Inglourious Basterds and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now, as you can see, during the boat scene, which is the start of the third act, it was the same mill from earlier. Now, let's talk about Nicodemus from the book. In the original novel, he was actually young. He is described as having a scarred face, but that he spoke graciously with an air of quiet dignity, and Mrs. Frisbee noticed two more things about him. First, the scar on his face ran across his left eye, and over this eye he wore a black patch fastened by a cord around his head. Second, he carried a satchel, rather like a handbag, by a strap over his shoulders. Nicodemus is still a very wise and noble character, and also shows great cleverness and intelligence and a high sense of morality. He is the prime proponent of the Thorn Valley Plan, freely expressing his distaste at the rats having to live by stealing from the Fitzgibbons or any other humans, but noting that the rats of NIMH cannot live either like ordinary rats or in the manner of humans. that they must set their own destiny and disdain the luxuries they set up for themselves in the colony under the rosebush. We're now almost an hour into the movie. In the final 22 minutes of the film, for those who are a fan of Pink Floyd, it will be cool if, while watching the rest of the movie, you play the song Echoes from the 1971 album Metal. Just play it when Mrs. Brisby is seen running home along the pond. Now here's this scene where Jeremy had his eyes on Mrs. Brisby's amulet and started to maybe act like Gollum from The Lord of the Rings or a drug addict. What's really disappointing is that although he's the comic relief, although he has more scenes in the film than he does in the book, as well as a more defined personality, he doesn't show up during the climax, only the end of the movie, which is for the best. Don't get me wrong, the humor from Jeremy actually serves as a balance where the rest of the film is dark. Up to this point, even Mrs. Brisby thinks he's getting on her nerves. Anyway, during this next scene, let's talk about Lucille Bliss, the voice of Mrs. Fitzgibbons, which you'll hear in a moment. She was born in 1916, known in the Bay Area and in Hollywood as the Girl with 1,000 Voices. A New York City native, Bliss lent her voice to numerous television characters, including the title character of the very first made-for-TV cartoon, Crusader Rabbit, Smurfette in the popular 80s cartoon The Smurfs, and Miss Bitters in the Nickelodeon animated series Invader Zim. In addition to her television roles, she was known for her work as a voice actress in feature films, mostly from Disney, like the voice of Anastasia Tremaine in Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and 101 Dalmatians. Bliss died from natural causes on November 8, 2012 in Costa Mesa, California at the age of 96. Now, right here, we see Mrs. Brisby attempting to drug the cat so the rats can move her house. Jonathan tried it, but was killed. Aegis tried it, but he broke his leg. Unfortunately, she didn't make it back, because she's been captured by the farmer's son, Billy. Now, listen to what Justin said. As mentioned earlier, this was given a G rating, in spite of some dark tones. Now, this wouldn't happen today. Nowadays, animated movies, especially the likes of Disney and Pixar, was given a PG rating, like Zootopia, Frozen, Inside Out, Encanto, and Tangled, probably for mild action and rude humor. Anyway, while the cat is drugged, the rats have come to move the Brisby house to safety, much to Auntie Shrew's dismay. Now let's talk about Tom Hatton, the voice of Farmer Fitzgibbons. He was born in 1926, known as the longtime host of The Popeye Show, originally the Pierpoint 5 Club and Family Film Festival on KTLA Channel 5 in Los Angeles in the 1960s through the 1980s. Hatton was one of those television pioneers for the 1950s and 60s programs done live, no matter what mistakes happened. His acting credits include portraying a corrupt U.S. Army general in the comedy film Spies Like Us in 1985 with Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase. He appeared as Captain Murdoch in several episodes of the TV show Gomer Pyle USMC and had a minor role as an officer in 3 episodes of Hogan's Heroes. Hatton died on March 16, 2019 at the age of 92. As you can see earlier, Mrs. Brisby overhear a phone conversation between Nim and the farmer and must warn the rats that Nim is coming. Here's another piece of trivia from the book concerning Jenner. Nicodemus has a great fondness and concern for his good friend Jenner. Unlike in the movie, Nicodemus and Jenner were always friends, even before their capture by NIMH. And after Jenner and his 6 friends depart the Rosebush colony, after the decision to move to Thorn Valley is certain, Nicodemus assumes that a constant concern for his old comrade, always eager for news of his fate and hoping for the best. When that block reaches midway, you cut the line. During the writing, the antagonist Jenner was given much more prominence in the movie, being only mentioned as a traitor who lives in the book to add drama to the narrative by giving it a more visible enemy. Now pay close attention. For a brief second, you can see the slash on Mrs. Brisby's arm before she fell back. Unlike the original work, Justin does not rescue Mrs. Brisby from the cage at the Fitzgibbons' house, and she now helps her children without the rat's assistance by using the amulet, once again giving focus to her personal story. As Bluth put it, The Secret of NIMH is really a story about Mrs. Brisby and her need to save her children. If the rats save her children, then she hasn't grown in the film. And this is where Jenner's plot is executed, when he slashes the ropes, causing the machinery to fall apart and kill Nicodemus, as the Brisby house crashes to the ground. Despite Jenner stating that the weight of the block crushed Nicodemus to death upon more and more viewings, he was actually killed by debris. Oh no. In the wreckage, you can see Nicodemus's limp hand. Anyway, let's talk about the casting of the movie. Goldman described the casting process as exciting, fun, and sometimes strange. He stated that focusing on the characteristics of each character, the voices and acting abilities were crucial, saying that using roles that added to a movie's texture was part of the team's philosophy in the development of the film. Goldman found the strangest casting decision to be Dom DeLuise for Jeremy the Crow, which Goldman, Bluth, and Pomeroy had considered after they watched the 1978 film The End. Elizabeth Hartman was cast as Mrs. Brisby, with Goldman calling her performance in A Patch of Blue so believable and sincere that we all felt that she was right for the part. Pomeroy suggested Derek Jacobi, who starred in the 1976 miniseries I, Claudius, to play the part of Nicodemus. Peter Strauss, whom the team previously saw in another miniseries from 1976, Rich Man, Poor Man, was cast as Justin. Paul Shenar was assigned to play Jenner since the staff liked his dark, powerful voice. Shakespearean actor John Carradine was perfect for the dark, ominous Great Owl, while Alder Ray was assigned to voice Jenner's reluctant accomplice Sullivan, whom Goldman said also had a great distinctive voice. As you can see, after Mrs. Brisby escapes the cage, she arrives to the fallen block, only to learn that Nicodemus is dead, told by Mr. Ages. But there isn't time for grief, and warns the rats that NIMH is coming. Jenner attempts to discredit her, saying that she has become hysterical, but the rest believe her and decide they must leave. According to Doug Walker's editorial video, Jenner represents the fear of change and the resistance of ethical responsibility, the need to keep their world of comfort and power at any cost. And we see that in great detail that he will go to any cost, killing their leader, fighting anyone who gets in his way, and attempting to gain even more power to cement his status. And now we're at the duel scene between Justin and Jenner. Here's an interesting fact concerning the choreography. In animating Justin and Jenner's sword fight, the animators reference similar sequences in films such as 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, and 1958's The Vikings, starring Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis, and Ernest Borgnine. Now, here's a great line from Justin when Jenner said, and that proves to be Jenner's downfall, as Justin wounds him. With Justin now in charge of the rats, he tells them that they should leave to Thorn Valley. However, still out for blood, Jenner tries attacking him from behind. But Sullivan throws a dagger to Jenner's back, thus avenging both Nicodemus and ending his terror for good. Just because the villain is now dead, the troubles are far from over. Now let's talk about the climax of the movie. In the original script, there was going to be a scene where Dragon the Cat attacked the Brisby home, and after the rats drove him off, Mr. Ages and Justin would explain to Brisby's kids and what happened to their father. A climax would have involved NIMH gassing the den, with Brisby and the other rats trying to escape it. Instead of the amulet, the only true challenge in the climax was Brisby making a leap of faith jump over a deadly chasm with her kids, only making it because of encouraging words previously spoken to her by Justin. Another draft had a scene involving Mrs. Brisby saving a beach sea bass, which impressed the rats. The climax originally had Brisby's children enter the abandoned lair of the rats. Mrs. Brisby runs off and saves them, only to be seemingly crushed by a cave-in. Jeremy, the children, and Mrs. Shrew would mourn her loss, but it turns out Mrs. Brisby is alive. The sea bass she rescued earlier helped her find a secret exit from the lair inside a pond. Surprisingly, the ending also implies that the rats of NIMH never actually existed. Neither the children nor the humans can find any evidence of their presence, and were a self-improving hallucination Mrs. Brisby was having, according to the writers. They meant it to be an ambiguous ending that could go one way or the other. Grab onto my foot! As you can see, the scene where the house sinks into the mud was very intense, with the children still inside. However, we only saw 3 children. Where we last see Timmy, he was still in bed. Shit. Although Mrs. Brisby managed to get out, she loses the amulet as it sinks into the mud, along with the house. All throughout the movie, she is encouraged to find her own courage and inner strength instead of falling back on others for help. And here's the big payoff, when she fights Justin to get back to her children, just as the stone erupts out of the mud and drifts towards her. And here it comes, the most famous shot in the whole entire movie. Now let's talk about the accolades. The Secret of NIMH won Best Animated Film of 1982 at the 10th Annual Saturn Awards, where it also received a nomination for Best Fantasy Film, losing to The Dark Crystal. In his acceptance speech, Bluth remarked, "Thanks, we didn't think anyone had noticed." The film was also nominated for Best Family Feature for Animation, Musical, or Fantasy at the 4th Annual Youth in Film Awards, being beaten by E.T. the Extraterrestrial, while the home video release received an award of excellence from the Film Advisory Board. In 2008, the American Film Institute nominated this film for its top 10 animation films list. This part reminds me of Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, where Yoda uses the Force to pull Luke's fighter out of the swamp after it sank. Just replace the music from this movie with the music from John Williams, and there, it fits so well. Now, just before the final scene with the moved house, there was some kind of deleted scene, which was the most known rumor of fans have heard, especially one known image of a kiss between Justin and Mrs. Brisby, drawn by one of the animators. In the comic adaptation, as well as the Golden Book, Mrs. Brisby and the Magic Stone, Brisby was seen giving the stone to Justin. Anyway, let's start wrapping up this commentary with a few more things. We now see Timmy looking out from the bedroom window, only having a single line of dialogue after appearing in a few scenes. That's Ian Fried voicing him, the same actor who played the son of Rocky Balboa in Rocky III, released in the same year. This was before she comes out as a transgender using the name Ina Fried. As you can see, Jeremy came back with a shitload of string, only to notice that the house is already moved to the Lee of the Stone. Unfortunately, his sadness didn't last long. When all of a sudden, that's Edie McClurg voicing Mrs. Wright, who's known for also starring in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and Disney's The Little Mermaid as Carlotta, as well as Barca in the Disney English dub of Kiki's Delivery Service. So Jeremy asks Brisby for the sparkly, which is the stone, but she was given it to Justin, who's now the leader of the Rats, as they journey to Thorn Valley. She advises Jeremy to be athletic. I really wish in the future some fan animator would make a short film that took place between the climax and the final scene of the movie, where Mrs. Brisby gives the stone to Justin. Looks like Jeremy has his happy ending. And that concludes our movie, as Jeremy and his girlfriend fly up into the sky. Anyway, it's really been a long journey to plan this commentary just before the deadline. Really, I have no idea how fucking hard a scripted commentary was. Same as scripting a discussion video. Regarding that, I'll someday discuss about fan fiction, mostly the most popular called The Secret of the Stone, which is an unauthorized sequel to the movie, but it's a whole lot better than the actual sequel, which fucking sucked. And if I do decide to do a commentary on that piece of shit, expect me to do this unscripted, which makes it a whole lot easier. Right now, I'll be taking a break from making NIMH related videos, focusing on other work. So until the next video, before I go, I please ask you to like, comment, subscribe, ring that bell, and spread that shit! Like the stuff that made the rats smart in The Secret of NIMH. This is Byron Kingsley from Grapevine, Texas, telling you, as always, to enjoy life, stay safe, do your push-ups, eat your vegetables, fuck The Secret of NIMH 2, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.